Anthony Haswell. Mr. Haswell's association with the rail industry began in 1958 with 2 years' service in the legal department of the Illinois Central Railroad. In 1967, he founded the National Association of Railroad Passengers, serving as a chairman and executive director through 1974. During this time, he was deeply involved in the development, refinement, and enactment of the legislation that created Amtrak, testifying before numerous congressional committees and working closely with committee staff. From 1975 to 1977, he was managing director of passenger services of the Rock Island Railroad, where he assisted with the transfer of the company's Chicago commuter trains to the Illinois Regional Transportation Authority. Thank you for joining me for this very important interview, Mr. Haswell. I've got a few questions for you, and we're going to start with how did you get interested in the passenger trains and why?
Well, I got interested in it when I was young enough that I don't really have a positive recollection, but if I had to guess, I think trains appealed to me because, unlike automobiles, they were not under the control of the people around me.
Tell me about your experience as managing director of the passenger services of the Rock Island Railroad. And I understand that was from 1975 to 1977?
That is correct. That was after my time in Washington, after I had formed the National Association of Railroad Passengers, and I came back to Chicago, and I got this job which was titled managing director, but really it was a quasi-public relations job because I was not an operating officer of the railroad and had no direct responsibility of getting the trains over the tracks back and forth every day with the commuters. But the railroad at that time was bankrupt, and it was desperately in need of government subsidy and support to keep the commuter trains running because, like practically all other commuter trains, they lost a significant amount of money and were a handicap toward a successful reorganization of the railroad. So during the time I was there were almost nonstop negotiations between the trustee in bankruptcy of the Rock Island and the other Chicago commuter railroads and the Regional Transportation Authority, which had been established by the Illinois legislature a few years back. But the collapse and financial distress of a couple of the railroads, notably the Rock Island and the Milwaukee Road and the Illinois Central, was what brought the RTA to life and made it a reality in terms of what it had to do in relation to its mission.
Oh, that's wonderful. When NARP was formed in Chicago, what year was that, 1967?
That's correct.
And did you, what hopes and dreams did you have for it, for the organization when you started it?
Well, when we went into the 1960s, the volume of passenger traffic kept going down and down. The jet airplanes, the interstate highways had become a reality, and the financial losses to the railroads were going up and up. And the railroad industry by the mid-1960s was hollering bloody murder about the need to be relieved of the financial obligation of running passenger trains. And so the question was, should we just let them get out, or should we try and come up with an alternative for saving at least some passenger trains and ultimately improving them without, and at the same time relieving the railroads of the financial burden that they were complaining of. So in I formed NARP in 1967, things were beginning to steam up to a crisis, you might say. I spent most of my time in Washington between 67 and 74. The solution that Congress decided upon was to create Amtrak, which was a quasi-public private government corporation which would take selected passenger train routes and try, ideally, to make them profitable, but at least to support them and keep them going on some halfway respectable basis. And Amtrak started business in April of 1971.
How hard was it to convince elected officials that passenger rail was an important mode of transportation?
I don't think there were very many that thought that it was an important mode of transportation, but there were enough of them that were politically scared enough so that they didn't want to be facing election or re-election while there was no more choo-choo train running through their state or their congressional district. That, bluntly, was what happened. So unfortunately, you had this dynamic, which is still, in my opinion, too prevalent today, where the political force says, don't let the trains be abandoned, but don't spend much money on them. So that's where we're at. We have far too many passenger trains on the track today that are on slower schedules than the equivalent trains, God forbid, of 1941. And they're being supported by public appropriations, whereas the 1941 trains, a few of them were actually making money.
Was there ever a time when you thought that the passenger trains were doomed?
Well, as we entered the countdown on the Amtrak legislation in 1970, the railroads were complaining louder and louder. The Interstate Commerce Commission was putting out the word that if Congress didn't pass the Amtrak bill, that they would let the railroads discontinue most of the trains, and so forth. So it got pretty tense in the fall of 1970. And President Nixon's attitude toward the whole thing was just about like I've described, that he didn't have any particular affection for passenger trains or conviction that there was a real place for them, but he had a political conviction that he didn't want to be in the White House when the passenger trains were discontinued. When Congress passed the Amtrak bill in the fall of 1970 and sent it to the president, and then for about 8 or 10 days, rumors kept flying around that the president was going to veto the bill because, as I say, he did not have an intrinsic interest in the subject, and his only interest was a political calculation to determine whether the cost of seeing the trains go away, or a lot of them go away, would seriously hurt his political situation. So we were biting our fingernails. I think if either the bill hadn't passed that fall, or if the president had vetoed it, and if the veto had been upheld, we would have seen relatively few intercity passenger trains left in the United States. The commuter trains by that time were beginning to be taken over under the umbrellas of various regional agencies and so forth in the larger cities where they did perform an invaluable service. So I'd say in the fall of 1970, it was a little bit touch and go.
What do you think the future of passenger rail in America?
In my opinion, the future is dependent upon the most elemental thing about railroads. That is the track and the roadbed and the signaling. There is not today in most areas of the country and between most cities an adequate fixed infrastructure to operate passenger trains at acceptable speeds, reliability, and so forth, and not enough capacity to run those trains at the same time support the ever-growing freight traffic, which is of serious concern to the railroads. The railroads are not being billed for the direct losses of passenger trains anymore, but they are very concerned that their freight trains are not ordered to sit on the side track while Amtrak goes zooming by, supported by federal subsidies. And this has been in the courts lately. I don't, there've been about 6 or 8 administrations in Washington, in the White House, since the formation of Amtrak in its commencement in 1971. Absolutely none of those administrations has had any serious interest in rail passenger service from a positive point of view, with the idea that it could make a real contribution to our transportation picture. So maybe you can say that unless and until we get a president in there who is serious about doing something and lets the Congress and so forth know that he or she is serious, it's hard to be optimistic.
I thank you so very much for allowing us to take this time with you today and learn about the past and the future of passenger rail in America.
You're welcome. It's a pleasure to be here.